The hegemony of refined species had, in its infinite wisdom and considerable pretension, spent the better part of 3 millennia perfecting the art of being absolutely insufferable while calling it diplomacy. Picture, if you will, a cosmic country club where the membership requirements included having evolved past the barbaric notion that sometimes people needed a good smack upside the head to adjust their attitude. The galaxy's self-proclaimed civilized races had gathered on Concordia Prime, a space station so pristine and diplomatically neutral that even the recycled air had been processed through 17 different cultural sensitivity filters. At the heart of this monument to bureaucratic masturbation sat the Grand Assembly Chamber, where representatives from across the galaxy engaged in what they generously called discourse, but what any reasonable observer might recognize as competitive intellectual masturbation. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering excess, crystalline walls that shifted color based on the emotional resonance of spoken words, floors that absorbed kinetic energy to prevent the unseemly sound of footsteps, and seating arrangements calculated by supercomputers to ensure optimal feng shui for 47 different species' anatomical requirements. The humans, being the newest and decidedly least refined members of this cosmic tea party, occupied what could charitably be called the kids' table. Their delegation consisted of precisely one person, Ambassador Zephyr Blackstone, a woman whose diplomatic credentials were impressive enough to earn her this posting, but whose natural instincts suggested she might be more at home resolving disputes with a crowbar than a carefully worded memorandum of understanding. Today's entertainment featured the Valkyrian Empire, a species that had evolved from apex predators into something far more dangerous, apex bureaucrats. They possessed the unique ability to make taxation forms seem like declarations of war, and had elevated condescension to an art form that lesser species could only admire from a respectful distance. Their representative, High Chancellor Krixmoth Velsarin, stood nearly 9 feet tall when his pride was fully inflated, which was essentially always. His forearms moved in practiced diplomatic gestures that managed to convey both superiority and barely contained disgust, while his chrome-plated carapace reflected the chamber's lights and patterns that somehow suggested other species should be grateful for the privilege of being looked down upon. The current debate centered around humanity's request to expand their trading routes through Valkyrian space, a proposal that had been under consideration for roughly as long as it takes for a star to be born, mature, and enter its midlife crisis. The humans, in their naive optimism, had submitted their request with supporting documentation that included economic projections, safety protocols, and environmental impact assessments. The Valkyrians had responded with a counterproposal consisting entirely of bureaucratic poetry written in 17 different languages, none of which actually addressed the original request. The honorable human delegation, Velsarin began, his voice carrying the musical quality of someone gargling with liquid arrogance, continues to demonstrate their species' charming inability to comprehend the subtle complexities of interstellar commerce. His translated words floated through the chamber's atmospheric processes, which automatically adjusted tone and inflection to sound maximally patronizing in each listener's native language. Ambassador Blackstone maintained her diplomatic expression, which she had practiced in the mirror until it achieved the perfect balance of attentive interest and suppressed homicidal rage. High Chancellor, we appreciate your comprehensive analysis of our proposal. Perhaps we could focus on specific areas where our documentation might benefit from your expertise. The other delegates observed this exchange with the kind of fascination typically reserved for watching someone attempt to teach quantum physics to a goldfish. The Crystalline Confederacy's representative, Station Commander Thil Ninerings, chimed softly in harmonics that translated roughly to, "Oh, this should be good." The Fluidian Trade Collective's Minister Gupta the Wise rippled with what passed for amusement among his gelatinous people, while maintaining the kind of professional demeanor that suggested he had seen this particular variety of diplomatic train wreck before. Expertise. Velsarin's laugh could have stripped paint from hull plating. Your species has been spacefaring for what, 2 centuries? We have been navigating the complexities of galactic commerce since before your ancestors discovered fire. Perhaps the humans should focus on mastering the basics of civilization before attempting to expand their sphere of influence. The chamber's emotional resonance crystals shifted to a lovely shade of barely contained violence, which the atmospheric processes dutifully noted in the official record. Blackstone's diplomatic smile tightened by approximately 3 millimeters, a change that would have been imperceptible to most species but registered as a seismic shift to anyone familiar with human facial expressions. "I'm sure the Valkyrian perspective on human development is illuminating," Blackstone replied, her words carefully measured and diplomatically meaningless. "However, our projections show mutual benefits from expanded trade relationships. Perhaps we could examine the specific economic advantages." Economic advantages. Velsarin interrupted, his forearms gesturing in patterns that managed to convey dismissal, superiority, and what could charitably be called polite contempt. "Your species offers nothing but raw materials and primitive manufacturing. You are, at best, a convenient source of basic resources. The notion that humanity could provide any meaningful contribution to galactic commerce is—" He paused, apparently searching for a word that would be maximally insulting while remaining technically diplomatic. "Quaint." The silence that followed this declaration stretched for exactly 4.7 seconds, which the chamber's recording systems noted as significantly longer than the average pause in diplomatic proceedings. During this interval, every delegate present became acutely aware that something in the atmospheric composition had shifted. The recycled air seemed to carry a hint of something that none of their atmospheric analyzers could quite identify, but that triggered ancient prey responses in species that had thought themselves long evolved past such primitive reactions. Blackstone stood slowly, her movement controlled and deliberate in the way that predators move when they have decided that stalking time is over. "High Chancellor," she said, her voice carrying a tone that the translation system struggled to process because it existed in frequencies that most civilized species had forgotten how to produce. "I want to make sure I understand your position correctly." "By all means," Velsarin replied, apparently oblivious to the fact that the chamber's crystals had now shifted to a color that most databases classified as deeply concerning. "Though I suspect the subtleties of interstellar economics may prove challenging for the human cognitive framework." The slap, when it came, produced a sound that the chamber's acoustic systems recorded at precisely 127.3 decibels, roughly equivalent to a sonic boom in an enclosed space. Velsarin's chrome-plated head snapped back with sufficient force to activate the station's emergency medical systems, which immediately began deploying trauma drones while simultaneously alerting security that someone had apparently detonated a small explosive device in the Grand Assembly chamber. For exactly 2.3 seconds, the assembled representatives of galactic civilization experienced something their species had not felt in millennia: genuine, primal shock. The crystalline confederacy's harmonics shattered into discord. The Fluidian delegation briefly lost cohesion. 3 different species translation systems crashed entirely, leaving their users staring at error messages in languages that had been extinct for geological ages. High Chancellor Krixmoth Velsarin, apex predator turned apex bureaucrat, staggered backward while his forearms flailed in patterns that his species' diplomatic training had never covered because no one had anticipated the need for what to do when someone physically strikes you during a trade negotiation protocols. His chrome-plated carapace had developed a distinctly humanoid handprint-shaped dent, and his voice, when he managed to produce sound again, carried frequencies that suggested his vocal cords had been professionally tuned by a percussionist. You struck me," he managed, his words emerging in a mixture of outrage, disbelief, and what sounded suspiciously like respect buried under several layers of diplomatic training. "Physical violence is forbidden in this chamber. It is a violation of every civilized principle." "High Chancellor," Blackstone interrupted, her voice now carrying the kind of calm that meteorologists typically associate with the eye of a hurricane, "I believe there may have been a misunderstanding in our cultural exchange." The assembled delegates watched in fascination as she approached the still staggering Valkyrian with the purposeful stride of someone who had decided that diplomatic immunity was a luxury she could no longer afford. The chamber's security systems had begun deploying containment fields, but they had been calibrated for civilized disputes, perhaps a strongly worded protest or an aggressive memorandum, not for whatever this was evolving into. "You see," Blackstone continued, her tone carrying the kind of reasonable explanation that made the chamber's AI systems flag her as either experiencing a complete psychological breakdown or achieving a level of diplomatic clarity that their programming couldn't process. "Humans have this charming primitive custom where sustained insults to our intelligence and character are typically addressed through direct physical feedback." Velsarin's forearms attempted to form defensive postures while simultaneously reaching for his diplomatic immunity credentials, creating a gesture that resembled a very confused spider trying to surrender. This is barbaric. The hegemony will hear of this assault on a diplomatic representative. Oh, I'm sure they will, Blackstone agreed, her smile achieving a level of diplomatic sincerity that could have been classified as a weapon of mass destruction. But first, let me provide you with a more comprehensive demonstration of human primitive customs. The punch, when it connected with Velsarin's center mass, produced several interesting effects simultaneously. First, the High Chancellor's chrome-plated carapace developed what impact analysis would later describe as significant structural reorganization. Second, the chamber's acoustic systems registered a sound that combined the best qualities of a gong, a thunderclap, and what one might hear if a mountain decided to applaud. Third, Velsarin achieved something that his species' evolutionary history had not prepared him for: involuntary rapid atmospheric displacement, also known as getting punched so hard you achieve temporary flight. The assembled delegates watched in the kind of stunned silence typically reserved for witnessing cosmic phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about how the universe operates. Station Commander Phil Ninering's crystalline form had shifted through several colors that her people's language had no names for. Minister Gupta the Wise had assumed a defensive blob configuration, while simultaneously trying to access emergency protocols for situations that his diplomatic training had never anticipated. High Chancellor Krixmoth Velsarin came to rest against the chamber's far wall, which had been constructed from materials designed to withstand stellar radiation and cosmic debris, but which had apparently not been stress-tested against the impact of a large alien bureaucrat traveling at velocities typically associated with spacecraft. The wall held, though it developed what architectural analysis would later describe as decorative humanoid impression patterns. Dr. Hexaplex, the station's chief medical officer, arrived with a team of emergency response drones just in time to witness Velsarin attempting to extract himself from his new wall-mounted position while making sounds that his species' medical databases had no classification for. Her 6 arms moved in practiced medical assessment patterns, while her primary vocal cords produced the kind of professional observations that suggested she had seen many things in her career, but none quite like this. Patient exhibits signs of comprehensive kinetic adjustment, she reported to her medical recorder, her tone carrying the clinical detachment of someone who had decided that attempting to understand the situation was less important than treating its consequences. Recommend immediate transport to Trauma Bay for creative impact assessment. Dr. Blackstone said, her voice now carrying the kind of helpful concern that made several delegates wonder if they were witnessing a complete break from reality or the emergence of a new form of diplomatic excellence. Please note that the High Chancellor may be experiencing some confusion about human cultural norms. I believe this educational exchange has been quite illuminating for all parties involved. The Chamber's security systems, having finally processed enough data to determine that they were dealing with what their programming could only classify as unprecedented interpersonal dynamics, deployed containment fields around the impact site, while simultaneously alerting every emergency response system on the station. The result was a light show that combined the aesthetic qualities of a rave, a medical emergency, and what might happen if a Christmas tree achieved consciousness and decided to have a seizure. Station Commander Phil Ninerings approached the scene with the cautious movements of someone who had realized that her understanding of diplomatic protocol might need significant revision. Her crystalline form had settled on a color that roughly translated to professionally confused but extremely interested, and her harmonic communications carried frequencies that suggested she was simultaneously appalled and impressed. "Ambassador Blackstone," she chimed, her translated words carefully neutral in the way that suggested she was navigating completely uncharted diplomatic territory. The station's regulations regarding physical altercations between diplomatic representatives are comprehensive. However, they appear to have been written under the assumption that such altercations would involve strongly worded protests rather than kinetic educational demonstrations. "Commander," Blackstone replied, her diplomatic expression having returned to its default setting of professional competence with undertones of barely contained violence, "I believe there may have been a significant misunderstanding regarding the nature of human diplomatic customs." High Chancellor Velsarin appeared to be under the impression that humans respond to sustained intellectual contempt with submissive acceptance. I felt it was important to correct this misconception before it led to more serious cultural misunderstandings. Dr. Hexaplex's medical assessment had progressed to the point where she was fairly confident that Velsarin would survive the experience, though his chrome-plated carapace would require what she diplomatically described as extensive cosmetic rehabilitation. Her 6 arms worked with practiced efficiency, while her secondary vocal cords provided a running commentary that combined medical observation with what sounded suspiciously like professional admiration. Patient structural integrity remains within acceptable parameters, she reported, though his diplomatic confidence appears to have sustained significant damage. Recommend extended observation for symptoms of enhanced cultural awareness. The emergency response had attracted attention from across the station, and representatives from dozens of species had gathered outside the Grand Assembly Chamber to observe the aftermath of what would later be described in official reports as an unprecedented interpersonal diplomatic learning experience. The crowd included everyone from junior diplomatic attachés to senior trade representatives, all attempting to process what their various sensory organs were telling them about the situation inside. Minister Gupta the Wise had recovered enough from his initial shock to assume his normal gelatinous configuration, though his surface tension continued to fluctuate in patterns that suggested he was experiencing something his species' emotional vocabulary had no adequate terms for. His translated communications carried a tone of someone who had witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about how civilized species were supposed to interact. "Ambassador," he gurgled, his words emerging through the kind of biochemical processes that made most other species grateful for translation technology. The Fluidian Collective has observed human behavior patterns for several rotations now, but we had not anticipated this directness of communication. Is this a standard component of human diplomatic methodology? Blackstone considered the question with a kind of thoughtful expression that suggested she was genuinely attempting to provide useful cultural information. Minister, humans have discovered that certain forms of communication benefit from what we call enhanced clarity. When verbal exchanges fail to achieve mutual understanding, we sometimes employ supplementary educational techniques. Supplementary educational techniques, Station Commander Thil 9 Rings repeated, her harmonics carrying what could charitably be described as fascinated horror. Is this what your species refers to as diplomacy? Well, Blackstone replied, her tone carrying the kind of helpful explanation that made several delegates wonder if they should be taking notes. We prefer to think of it as comprehensive cultural exchange. High Chancellor Velsarin now has a much deeper understanding of human customs, while I have gained valuable insight into Velcarian impact resistance. Dr. Hexaplex had completed her initial assessment and was preparing to transport Velsarin to the medical bay when the High Chancellor managed to produce something resembling coherent speech. His forearms moved in gestures that combined surrender, confusion, and what looked suspiciously like grudging respect, while his voice carried frequencies that suggested his vocal cords had been professionally recalibrated. The human. He began, then stopped, apparently searching for words that his diplomatic training had never provided. Your species possesses unexpected educational methodologies. High Chancellor, Blackstone said, approaching him with the kind of concerned expression that made the medical drones adjust their threat assessment protocols. I hope this cultural exchange has been informative. Perhaps we could continue our trade discussions once you've had time to process the educational components of human diplomatic customs. The silence that followed this suggestion lasted exactly 7.2 seconds, during which every delegate present became aware that they were witnessing something that would require significant revision to their understanding of interspecies relations. The chamber's atmospheric processes had given up attempting to categorize the emotional resonance and had settled on displaying a color that roughly translated to unprecedented diplomatic complexity. Customs are indeed educational, Velsarin managed, his words emerging through what Dr. Hexaplex's medical scanners indicated was a combination of physical discomfort and something that looked suspiciously like increased respect. Perhaps the Velcarian Empire has misunderstood certain aspects of human cultural development. Understanding is the foundation of all diplomatic progress, Blackstone agreed, her smile achieving the perfect balance of diplomatic sincerity and barely contained satisfaction. I believe this exchange has established an excellent foundation for future negotiations. The assembled delegates watched as Dr. Hexaplex's medical team carefully extracted the High Chancellor from his wall-mounted position and began the process of transporting him to facilities designed to address what their medical databases could only classify as comprehensive diplomatic adjustment syndrome. The procession moved with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested the station's medical staff had decided that attempting to understand the situation was less important than treating its immediate consequences. As news of the educational cultural exchange spread throughout the station, representatives from across the galaxy began arriving at the Grand Assembly Chamber to observe the aftermath and attempt to understand what this development meant for the future of interspecies diplomacy. The crowd included everyone from junior protocol officers to senior ambassadors, all trying to process the implications of what they had witnessed or heard described. The Zephyrian Trade Collective's representative, a being whose species had evolved past physical conflict roughly 1 million years ago, stood in the chamber's entrance while making sounds that his translator rendered as a mixture of fascination and existential confusion. His sensory organs, designed to detect the subtle emotional frequencies that characterized civilized discourse, had apparently short-circuited when exposed to the aftermath of what could only be described as authentic human communication. The atmospheric composition, he observed, his words emerging through biochemical processes that most other species found disturbing but were too polite to mention, contains trace elements that our senses cannot identify. It appears that human emotional expression produces chemical compounds that our databases have no classification for. Ambassador Blackstone had taken her seat at the human delegation's table and was reviewing her notes with a kind of professional competence that suggested the recent educational demonstration had been a perfectly normal component of diplomatic procedure. Her expression carried the satisfaction of someone who had successfully conveyed important cultural information while simultaneously establishing the foundation for more productive future discussions. The human approach to diplomatic discourse, Station Commander Thil 9 Rings observed. Her harmonics now carrying what could only be described as professional curiosity mixed with carefully contained terror, appears to emphasize immediate feedback regarding the effectiveness of communication strategies. We believe in comprehensive cultural exchange, Blackstone replied, her tone carrying the kind of helpful explanation that made several delegates wonder if their own diplomatic training might benefit from significant revision. When verbal communication fails to achieve mutual understanding, supplementary educational techniques can provide valuable clarity for all parties involved. Over the following hours, as word of the incident spread throughout Concordia Prime and beyond, something unprecedented began to occur. Representatives from dozens of species approached the human delegation to inquire about what they carefully described as enhanced diplomatic methodologies. The conversations carried the kind of cautious fascination typically associated with discussing dangerous but potentially useful technologies. The Crystalline Confederacy's junior protocol officer, a being whose species had spent millennia perfecting the art of non-confrontational discourse, approached Blackstone with the kind of careful movements that suggested she was simultaneously terrified and intrigued by the possibility of learning about alternative communication strategies. "Ambassador," she chimed, her harmonics carefully modulated to avoid any frequencies that might be interpreted as challenging. "The Confederacy has observed that your educational demonstration achieved in minutes what our traditional diplomatic processes have failed to accomplish in cycles. Would it be possible to learn more about human cultural exchange techniques?" "Certainly," Blackstone replied, her smile carrying the kind of helpful enthusiasm that made the protocol officer simultaneously grateful and concerned about what she might be getting herself into. Human diplomatic customs emphasize the importance of authentic communication and immediate feedback regarding the effectiveness of discussion strategies. We believe that sustained intellectual contempt typically indicates a failure in mutual understanding that can benefit from direct corrective measures. The word spread through the station's diplomatic community with a kind of velocity typically associated with gossip about romantic scandals or significant changes in cafeteria menus. Within hours, representatives from across the galaxy were approaching their human contacts to inquire about what they diplomatically described as comprehensive cultural education techniques. The effect was remarkable. Diplomatic negotiations that had been stalled for decades suddenly began producing results as representatives from various species discovered that the threat of enhanced cultural exchange provided powerful motivation for achieving mutual understanding. Trade disputes that had persisted through geological ages were resolved when both parties realized that continuing the disagreement might result in educational demonstrations of human diplomatic customs. The Velkarian Empire. After High Chancellor Krixmoth Velsarin recovered enough to participate in official communications, issued a statement that managed to combine formal diplomatic language with what could only be described as profound respect for human cultural practices. The statement noted that the Empire had achieved significant new understanding of human customs and looked forward to continued educational exchanges in future negotiations. Dr. Hexaplex's medical report became required reading for diplomatic personnel throughout the sector, not for its clinical observations, but for its detailed analysis of what she diplomatically described as the physiological effects of comprehensive cultural education. Her recommendations for enhanced protective equipment during future human diplomatic encounters were implemented across the station within days. Ambassador Zephyr Blackstone found herself in the unprecedented position of being simultaneously the most feared and most respected human representative in galactic history. Diplomatic invitations arrived with frequency patterns typically associated with emergency communications, while the messages themselves carried the kind of carefully respectful language that suggested their authors were genuinely interested in cultural exchange while being absolutely terrified of receiving comprehensive educational demonstrations. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that humanity's introduction to galactic diplomacy through what could only be described as spectacular violence had resulted in more productive interspecies negotiations than had been achieved in centuries of civilized discourse. The galaxy's self-proclaimed refined species had discovered that sometimes the most sophisticated communication technique involved making sure everyone understood that there were consequences for persistent intellectual contempt. Station Commander Thil Ninering's final report on the incident noted that the human approach to diplomatic education had achieved unprecedented levels of mutual understanding and respect between participating parties. Her recommendation that all future diplomatic venues be equipped with enhanced medical facilities and structural reinforcement was approved unanimously by the Hegemony Council, along with a new requirement that all diplomatic personnel receive training in human cultural awareness and emergency response protocols. As Ambassador Blackstone prepared her own report on the day's events, she reflected on the curious fact that a moment of spectacular diplomatic failure had somehow evolved into the foundation for more successful interspecies relations than had been achieved through millennia of polite, civilized discussion. The sound of her punch had indeed spoken louder than years of carefully worded diplomatic protests, though she suspected that her superiors on Earth might require some time to fully appreciate the educational value of her enhanced cultural exchange techniques. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about the difference between being civilized and being effective. Sometimes, it turned out, the most sophisticated approach to resolving disagreements involved making sure everyone understood that sustained intellectual contempt was not a sustainable communication strategy. The humans had brought something to galactic diplomacy that had been missing for eons: the immediate, undeniable feedback of authentic consequences. And if those consequences occasionally involved High Chancellors achieving temporary flight capabilities and developing decorative wall impressions, well, that was simply the price of comprehensive cultural education. The sound of that slap still stung, but her punch had indeed spoken louder, in a language that the entire galaxy could understand.